thanks to Neil and Stanley for setting out the key issues in the book and sort of explaining very clearly about the software and the hardware industries, but also the sort of the lessons. Later on, I will ask you to sort of to comment on Simon's comments. But I think what I should do first is to open it up to sort of general questions and points people like to raise at this stage. And I think this opens up a very interesting discussion, both specific about manufacturing or software and hardware industries, but also more generally about what is the role of government policies, and also actually about was this actually a jump for China or not, and was it actually was it a particular achievement that other countries should be copying as well. Okay, let's open it up, and if you could identify yourself, say who you are, and talk in a microphone because it is also streamed online. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, my name's Piers Davenport, by the way. I wanted to compliment both authors of the study on this fascinating work. Start with the easy question. I've come across this study in rather a tardy fashion by coming along to the session today. Where can I read about this study in a précis format? Has it been published in a journal? I see you have a book there, and I'd quite like to buy it, but I'd like to see a summary version. So that's the first question. Second question is, you've talked a lot about government role in factors of production, in business environment, etc. I was wondering whether there's a correlation, whether you've had a look into this, of government procurement and success in those two sectors. I'm thinking in particular, arguably in Europe, the growth in telecommunications, in mobile telecommunications, perhaps emanates in the government procurement of the 70s and 80s in the military sector, and when they were developing mobile telephony on the battlefield, and when those governments actually acted rather parochially in awarding contracts to companies in their companies who are actually operating in their countries.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's take two more. Here.
Thank you for your very nice talk. My name is Dipinder Sekho. I'm studying public policy at LSE. I also run a small IT firm in Delhi, Noida. I have three questions. One, in the data for China, especially for hardware, is Taiwan included in your study? And second, when you talk of new industries and from the point of view of putting the policies, getting the policies right, what do you think are the new emerging industries now? For example, is biotech one for India, and are the policies right over there? Third, as you know, we have a new government, and Prime Minister is probably getting sworn in right now in Delhi. With the left not part of this term, do you see a major change in the reform process of manufacturing industry? There's a lot of demand for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Lady over here.
Hi, my name's Megha. I'm from the LSE. I had two really quick questions. One was that you say you had an example about the fact that non-equity alliances with Indian software firms was significant, and I was wondering what you thought was the story behind that. And secondly, how do you measure clustering? In your case, knowledge agglomeration economies. What sort of variable do you use to measure that? Thanks.
Okay, let's take these questions in turn.
I will start with ones that I know some answers to, and leave the others to Neil. Hope he knows the answers to them. But let me begin by saying my special thanks to Simon Commander. Simon, you have a substantial body of work in this field, and it was well read and educated us and well cited in the book. So I'm pleased that you're here today, especially. There is no summary or précis now. Actually, what we're talking about as we travel from place to place, Neil and I, is what that what you call précis should be and where it should be, where it should go. So the book is first and the summary is second. You have to read the whole book now. There is no shortcut just yet. Maybe in a few months we have a better answer for you. Government role in procurement, I think in Indian software is 0. In China, not 0, because one thing that was done in China as an example is, which promoted the growth of Chinese software products, is the adoption of certain accounting standards that were not the same as imported software would produce for you. So you had to have a Chinese adapted software accounting product. So that might be called the government procurement, a regulation that promoted Chinese product, software product development. Taiwan is not included, no. I must say, you look like you could come from India, and you have an IT firm. Well, of course you have an IT firm. Every time I go to India by air, there's a young Indian boy sitting next to me. I always ask him, "Are you in the software business?" The answer is always yes. And what are you traveling to India for? It's either to meet my parent company or to get married, one of the two. The alliances story is this. Because the Indian companies needed most critically access to Western markets, which they didn't have, how to get it. NRIs were one way. That is, I think, the one important contribution of NRIs in the early years, not now. But the other way was use the customers of your alliance partners. So you make an alliance with Oracle or Microsoft or IBM, and you install, implement, customize their platforms for their customers. So you need a handful of customers who are the platform makers. You don't need their customers whom you don't have no access to. So that was one of the main early ways that the alliances were motivated and how they worked. Clustering measure, it was some questionnaire items which assessed the importance of these benefits of clustering, knowledge sharing, larger labor pool, for example. And then we also measured from other sources, not our work, the concentration of software firms in certain geographical locations, and found out that there is no difference in India or China. Therefore, you think of India as Bangalore. Well, that's not true. It's Bangalore, it's Mumbai, Pune, it's Delhi, Noida, Gurgaon. After that, it's Chennai, Hyderabad. And you take those as one, I mean, they're not one cluster, but multiple clusters. In China, you have Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shenzhen. It's about all the same. What we do find from another study, not ours, this is Tarun Khanna's work, that the clustering is less important. The knowledge sharing and labor pool is less important to firms in clusters because that's already there in the cluster. So the agglomeration effects are minimized there. The other answers I don't have, Neil, maybe you do.
Neil, maybe you can also answer to Simon's points as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the points which Simon raised helps answer the question about the role of government procurement. I think, yes, it was important, but I don't think we actually asked directly about it in our survey, so that was one omission by us. But clearly, Chinese software was largely driven by a domestic market, and government purchasing was an important part of that market. And the same in hardware, but I think that in hardware in both countries, governments had a preference for domestic production, but in India, the domestic producers really weren't there. So it's part of the story, but not the whole story. You can only have procurement preferences if you have a source of domestic supply. So you have to also explain how you got to the point where you could exercise those kind of preferences. There was a question about whether what we learn about software is applicable to other new industries like biotech. And I think actually, yes, that is. I mean, IFC has been a big investor in biotech as well as IT in India, and I think what we've seen there does support, again, has many of the similar features to software. It's not very dependent on a whole lot of infrastructure, a whole lot of supply chain linkages. You can set this up without a lot of foreign investment, without a lot of capital injections. And what is really important is an enabling environment from government. And government has also set up some biotech parks and incubators, which I think have been modelled to some extent on the software technology park. So I think the biotech example of India, which is also growing very fast, I think does support the contention that this wasn't a one-off fluke, but it is a policy which can be, to some extent, replicated. I think Simon's point is very well taken about the fact that in China, to a large extent, the growth of manufacturing was not a big discontinuity. But I think what we would emphasize in the hardware story was that this was a much more sophisticated type of manufacturing than the typical East Asia manufacturing story, where you were mostly doing assembly and really taking components and bolting them together and re-exporting with a high level of inputs. This was a type of manufacturing where there was a high degree of value added in the Chinese step of the manufacturing process. There was quite a lot of evidence of R&D, of patents being filed, and so forth. Now, on the question of IP policies, which Simon also raised, we did ask companies about that in the survey, and actually the results we got from them was that they didn't feel that IP regulations or the lack of them are actually a big hindrance either in software or hardware. So I think that there probably is more to say about it, just that we didn't pick it up strongly in the survey results. And lastly, in terms of the question of where does India's manufacturing policy go now? Got successful election results, so maybe Congress will be emboldened to move fast. And I think, as I say, they already have done a lot in terms of putting in place a special economic zone policy for manufacturing, which really is to some extent modelled on the Indian experience. But what you find that is still the bottleneck is, on the one hand, infrastructure, which, as we know, India is working very hard and investing a lot to try and catch up with China, but remains a long way behind. But the other critical difference, I think, for manufacturing in India compared to China is the ability to access industrial land. And I think the recent example of this was very telling when Tata wanted to start manufacturing the nano car and got invited by the government of West Bengal to build it there, and was given a big allocation of land and all the SEZ treatments that they could ask for. But when they actually tried to occupy the land and build on it, there was a lot of popular protest, and in the end they had to abandon the site after they'd spent 18 months building the factory, ship all the capital goods to Gujarat and start all over again there. Huge costs. I don't think that's a story that you see very often in China. Once government allocates industrial land, it stays allocated, and whatever protests there are do not usually lead to that kind of change. So, this is an example of grassroots democracy in action, and make whatever value judgments you will about that. I think it's a difference when it comes to a manufacturer looking to set up a plant in China or India. I think access to industrial land is now really, at the top of the things that people worry about.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent we can also see this as a sort of a very radical, actually, a radical book, in the sense that just 1 or 2 months ago, it was sort of Gordon Brown said the end of laissez-faire is over, and I also see a lot of messages coming in this book on this. It's about sort of industrial growth was not the result of laissez-faire. There's a lot of things that can be done. Also in his foreword, Justin Lin, the chief economist, mentioned there's no silver bullet for development. You need to do a lot about the investment climate, but there's actually much more you can do than the investment climate. There are microclimates, to paraphrase the word that you use, and there's a role for sectoral policies. And I think is this a very radical shift? I think that's something that you may want to answer as well. Are there any other questions in the coming 10-15 minutes? Let's take 2 there and 2 there. Sheila and then Jody.
Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. A couple of questions on the lessons you draw. First, on the importance of certification of managers, which was higher in India for software, higher for China in hardware. I can't see that as being a national characteristic or a government policy or anything of the sort. Is it causation the other way? It was in the export industry which was becoming successful, certification became more common rather than the other way around. And otherwise, why did it happen? I mean, why did the difference between hardware and software happen? On clustering, I was surprised to see this. One of you mentioned that the Chinese Special Economic Zone policy encouraged clustering, and India didn't, and this therefore lost out on hardware. I mean, my understanding of clustering has been that this is something that happens because it is of economic advantage to the clusters. You don't need to be told to cluster. You cluster because it's good for you, and this is how clusters develop. So I can't quite see why having or not having SEZs could be an explanation. And my first reaction to the conclusion that it's better to move into a new industry than an old one because there's fewer existing bad government policies about was sort of, yes, that's interesting. But my second is, yes, of course. I mean, moving into a new industry is what development is about. So if you don't move into a new industry, you really shouldn't be being studied by any of us in this room in the first place. So I don't quite see under what circumstances just developing an old industry would be a sensible policy with or without previous government intervention.
Okay. Jody?
You mentioned about the importance of the Indian domestic market for the hardware, for the software industry. No, sorry, it was China. The importance of the Chinese domestic market for the software industry. But I was wondering if you could discuss a bit more about the importance of the export markets for Chinese hardware. I mean, where was it going? Where was the FDI coming from? Was it part of kind of triangle manufacturing or not? You just haven't really discussed that much.
Okay. There were two questions here. Yeah, there and there.
My first question is regarding the way. I'm Nidhi. I'm from the University of Cambridge. My first question was that in case of India, do you think that it's important to even look at the regional level policies, because I think states have their own dynamics in India, and even if we look at software clusters, there are actually just 3 and 4 places where they're clustered. So the regional and the local dynamics also play a role. So rather than just looking at factor costs and stuff, we could even look at from an innovation system framework where we look at all the different actors and try to find out how it really works, and why does it work in only these areas. And because if we say Bangalore, why it's grown and why Pune is not as vibrant as Bangalore, so there are obvious differences in that. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Claire Lisserman. I'm a consultant on ethical and fair trade, although you'll be pleased my question's nothing to do with that. I'm just intrigued about the lack of Chinese exports of software, whether that's because Chinese firms have been trying to export software and failing, or whether they're just not trying in the first place.
Okay, thank you. I mean, some very interesting questions about sort of special economic zones, I think, and clustering. I mean, does it happen, clustering, or do you need to promote it? And if we believe you, it worked in China, does it always work in all countries under all circumstances, or are there particular ideas when it works? So there are a range of questions, I think. Would you like to go first, Neil? And then
sure. Let me have a first go at this. Response to your challenge as to how radical is really the policy recommendations coming out of this. I think we view this as somewhat incremental, because nothing here goes against the sort of standard policy descriptions of get the overall investment climate right, avoid excessive taxation, excessive make the cost of compliance with government policies reasonable for the private sector. But what it suggests is that governments don't need to stop there, and they can more proactively work to remove the particular barriers in particular sectors. And
it's like investment climate plus.
Yeah. And then Sheila's challenge to us as well, well, of course you want to develop new sectors, but I think actually it maybe wasn't so obvious. I think in India, the existing sectors which are just being held back by government regulations, there's still a huge amount of untapped growth there. And so if I'd been an advisor to the government of India, I wouldn't have said go after new industries. I would have said get the old industries right. But it's just the political economy of doing that is so difficult. So I think the growth is both a combination of increasing productivity in existing industries as well as new industries. In terms of clustering, yes, as you say, companies have their own incentives to create clusters spontaneously. The problem comes where there are barriers in the way which make it difficult for that to happen, and that may be because there is not access to industrial land, there's regulatory barriers in the way of businesses forming in a particular location. And so the value of special economic zones was not to create a value in clustering which wasn't otherwise there, it was to remove some of the barriers which made it difficult for firms to agglomerate. And so that's the way I would describe that. And the question on state-level policies in India, I think what we saw was that most of the policy changes in India, unlike in China, were things which were done at a national level, the software technology parks and some are really national level policies. And even today, I can't think of a whole lot of state-level policies that have been put in place to encourage software. So the initial clustering happened, I think, mostly where there were links to IITs, places like Bangalore and Chennai, but now the distribution of software companies in India is more, it just matches the distribution of where university-educated labor is. So most of the big cities now have a software cluster there. It's in Calcutta, it's in Pune now, it's in Mumbai, it's really in all the big cities of India. So I think we see much more of a differentiation of policies at provincial level in China than we do at state level in India. Let's see if Stan would like to pick up some of the other questions.
You asked about this point we make, not very quantitatively, rigorously, about management effectiveness. It's hard to be persuasive about this, I acknowledge, and we don't know if it is an effect or a cause. That's quite right. If I were to be a bit more speculative about it and try to answer why is it that we believe Indian managers were better than Chinese in software services especially, I would suggest a number of components. And one of them comes possibly to Indian national culture, because Indian software services was and still is largely a matter of one-off customized contracts with Western clients. So each project is a new project. That requires some amount of flexibility and willingness to embrace change, all of which is favored, I think, by the features of Indian national culture, but not Chinese. So maybe Indians are better at this because of the country in which they come from than Chinese are. But also, if you have Indians in Silicon Valley who are engineers become managers, then of course they have acquaintance and experience with software production and project management. And to the extent they can then provide the bridge to the market in the US, supplier in India, you have the ability to develop Indian software managers because of the NRIs in Silicon Valley in the early days. Mentioning also that currently I think that's not very important, but it might have been then. So although India was not exactly an open economy until 85 or 91, I think probably more articulation to the West than China. So to the extent that project management was something needed and Western in its orientation, Indians had more acquaintance with it than Chinese did over all of those growing up years. Maybe one more thing. Why doesn't China's software company export? Are they trying? I don't know if they're trying or if they're trying and failing. For sure, they had a very big and growing market at home. Does that explain not trying to export? I doubt it, but I don't know the answer to that question.
I mean, of course, another question is, should they export? Particularly the current climate, where exports have gone down, and where particularly industries that were dependent on exports and on trade, should they export? I mean, there's a big domestic market out there. Should they actually have oriented themselves at the domestic market, and it was actually a good choice too?
Well, the answer is no. If they have comparative disadvantage in software, advantage in hardware, they should not export software. But we don't know that answer.
Just to add one footnote to that, if I may. Yeah, I think the size of the Indian software sector now means that they've done a lot of learning by doing, and they probably do now have export potential. I think the rapid growth of the domestic market has meant they haven't had to try too hard. But the footnote I want to mention is that some of the big Indian software companies like Infosys have built up a presence in China recently. And initially that was done mainly because they wanted to address the Chinese domestic market, and having a domestic presence was helpful for that. But also they find it easier to teach Chinese programmers to program in Japanese. And Japan's the second biggest market for software after the US. And so I think there is potential there for China to be a base for software exports to Japan. But it's interesting that Indian management seems to be spotting that potential more quickly than China. So just an interesting footnote on that discussion.
I would just add one note about are they trying to export? It was the Chinese people who told us that this CMM thing we thought was a marketing ploy, not a serious thing. They said we were wrong about that. And now we are going for those certifications, but it's a little too late. So I guess they were not attentive to the export market, how you get there. They dismissed it because they had enough business at home, perhaps.
Okay. Are there any more questions? There's one there. And the final question.
If you were to take your experiences and learning and look at the eastern seaboard of Africa, which are now getting an internet pipe, and I know Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda are all looking some IT industries. What 3-4 pieces of advice would you give if you were sitting with the appropriate person there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a very good question to finish off with. I think there are of course still a range of factors that have been conducive to growth in the various sectors, and I think that's, in a sense, with the investment climate literature, suggests that there are a whole list of indicators that you need to address and need to think about in order to be competitive and stimulate growth. But there might also be some binding constraints, some specific factors. What is the one single factor that you would single out? What would unleash good management practices that would lead to software development, or what are the sort of the 3 factors that Kenya would need to take into account?
I have one idea. The industry is rather mature now. Indian firms are trying to move farther out the value chain, not so successfully, but trying. If I were a Kenyan, knowing nothing about the company, I would try to be a alliance partner with an Infosys or a smaller company and do the entry-level work they would like to leave behind to move on to something which is higher margin. Start at the entry level. And since you don't know the markets either, let the Indian alliance example work for me as a third level.
And to add a couple of things to that, I mean, I think we get this question a lot from other countries, whether in East Africa or elsewhere in Asia, who want to emulate the experience. And actually, not that many countries have been able to do it, so it's obviously not that trivial an exercise to do it. And I think part of it is because there is an aspect of reaching scale which matters in software as well as hardware, and it's not about the economies of scale in production so much as in marketing, that clients prefer to deal with fewer suppliers, and breaking into the market is hard for new companies. It was easier when the Indian company started because the industry wasn't as mature, as Stan said, but the way they worked with building marketing alliances, I think, was quite critical to that. So I'd say think about the marketing and how you're going to approach the market entry as a non-trivial problem. And then secondly, I would say look at your investment climate, look at all the indicators of how easy or difficult it is to do business in your country. First best solution is obviously to reduce those barriers across the board for all industries, but if that's not doable in the short term, see if you can make some sector-specific exemptions and concessions for the sector so that there's a growth opportunity for this new infrastructure so you can take advantage of it. Then thirdly, as our study suggests, the availability of skilled management is a critical input. So just having low-cost labour and infrastructure alone isn't enough. So I'd also say to government, look at where your potential entrepreneurs and managers are going to come from and try and make life easy for them, whether it's allowing non-resident Kenyans to make it easy for them to come back and get residence, or being open to other skilled migrants, whatever it may be. But I think you need to also think about where the management capacity is going to come from.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's a loud call for investment climate plus plus, and there's a lot of more analysis that need to be done to understand what works where, how, and what are the binding constraints. Let us thank Neil, Stanley, and Simon for their comments and presentations. And we have a link to this book on the website, so you've got more details there, how you can acquire it, I think. And I think chapter 13 was a very good summary of a lot of things, but I would encourage you to read the whole book. And thank you for coming to this.